Courtney Michelle Love, born Courtney Michelle Harrison on July 9, 1964, in San Francisco, grew up suspended between bohemia and instability. Her mother, Linda Carroll, later became a psychotherapist and memoirist. Her father, Hank Harrison, worked on the fringes of the music world. From early on, Love's life followed migratory routes, Oregon, New Zealand, back to the Pacific Northwest, with stints in juvenile detention and brief experiments with college courses abroad. The outline sounds mythic because much of it is. A precocious, itinerant teenager who would later turn that volatility into art. By the late 1980s, Love had taught herself guitar and, after a handwritten ad listing influences from Sonic Youth to Fleetwood Mac, she formed a band that matched her appetite for abrasion and melody, Hole. The core partnership with guitarist Eric Erlandson would anchor the group's first era. Love named the band Hole, a word as blunt as it is symbolic, and set about welding noise, confession, and confrontation into a single stage presence. The debut, Pretty on the Inside, arrived in 1991, its serrated edge produced with help from Kim Gordon and Don Fleming. It announced Hole as a force in a crowded, competitive moment for alternative rock. What came next is the hinge of her music career. Live Through This, released in April 1994, carried choruses that could bloom into pop and then collapse back into scalding fury. It appeared 1 week after the death of Love's husband, Kurt Cobain, a cruel coincidence that permanently entwined the record's reception with grief and scrutiny. In time, however, the album's craft, its tinsel lyrics, its tangled harmonies, won out, and it now stands as a canonized work of the 1990s. Contemporary and retrospective critics alike have described it as both controversial and defining, a benchmark for how female rage and vulnerability could live in the same song cycle. Success scaled up again with Celebrity Skin, 1998, a sleeker, sun-bright record whose title track and deep cuts twisted Los Angeles glamour into something sharp and self-aware. Released on September 8, 1998, it became Hole's most commercially polished statement, framed by glossy guitars and hooks you could hum in a supermarket aisle, without diminishing the bite underneath. Parallel to her music, Love pursued acting with a seriousness that surprised skeptics, who had pegged her as a tabloid fixture rather than a craftsperson. She took early roles in Alex Cox's punk-era films, Sid and Nancy, 1986, where she played a small part written for her after an audition for the lead, and Straight to Hell, 1987, a dust-cake satire whose cult ensemble included Joe Strummer and Dennis Hopper. Those credits are often remembered as footnotes now, but at the time they hinted at a performer drawn to messy, combustible worlds she recognized. In 1996, working with director Milos Forman on The People vs. Larry Flynt, Love found the role that would alter perceptions, Althea Flynt, a character equal parts charisma and collapse. The performance gathered awards from critics groups and earned her a Golden Globe nomination for Best Actress, recognition that moved her from novelty to serious lead, at least in the industry's eyes. The film itself was hailed by major outlets, including the New York Times, as a bracing, unlikely triumph of biography and provocation. Further roles followed, notably as Lynn Margulies in Man on the Moon, 1999, a portrayal that required Love to play steadiness against Andy Kaufman's chaos. If the 1990s mapped a rise, the 2000s tested durability. Hole disbanded. Love released her solo album, America's Sweetheart, in 2004, a raw, messy, media-shadowed project that divided critics and struggled commercially. It remains a fascinating artifact of its moment, a record made by an artist in transition, haunted by addiction and litigation, but unwilling to mute herself for safety. 6 years later, she reactivated the Hole moniker with Nobody's Daughter, 2010, recorded with a new lineup and a sound that gestured back toward the austerity and scrape of her earlier work. For admirers and detractors alike, both releases testified to a fact that mattered more than the charts. Love was still writing, still recording, still insisting that the work was the point. Her public life, of course, never existed on a separate track. Love's struggles with substance use and the law, open, sometimes chaotic, sometimes tragic, were documented almost to overexposure. Yet in 2014, she notched an unlikely legal milestone. A California jury found that she was not liable in what was widely labeled the first U.S. Twitter defamation trial to reach a jury, a case brought by her former attorney Rhonda Holmes. The verdict turned mostly on the standard of actual malice. An appeals court later upheld the outcome. In the same broader period, a separate dispute with a designer over earlier online statements yielded penalties that Love acknowledged even as she celebrated the larger First Amendment victory. The mixed ledger was typical of her public life. Absolution in one column, complications in another. Acting returned as a steadying current in the mid-2010s. Love appeared on the seventh and final season of Sons of Anarchy, 2014, as Miss Harrison, and then on Empire, 2015, as Elle Dallas, a combustible rock diva whose arc let her harness both camp and pathos. Around the same time she tackled Kansas City Choir Boy, an experimental pop opera by Todd Almond that ran at New York's Prototype Festival and later toured. Reviews singled out the paradox that has long defined her voice, a grainy instrument that can sound like a threat or a plea, often in the same sustained note. What does that legacy look like from the vantage point of culture now? She is part of the reason a woman can scream on a stage and be heard as a composer of feeling rather than an avatar of hysteria. She is part of the reason an actress known for tabloid headlines can be taken seriously the moment the lights go down and the scene begins. She is part of the long, messy proof that survival is a kind of art too. And she is still, above all, a maker of songs that won't leave and of performances that complicate easy sympathy. It is tempting to wish for a version of the story with less wreckage. But to subtract, that is to subtract the grain in the voice, the serration in the guitar, the realism in a performance that risks being too much. Courtney Love has always been too much for someone. That has been, from the beginning, her method and her gift.